If you watch the news or scroll through social media or even just listen to the conversations happening at your local coffee shop, you would really think the American middle class is on the brink of total extinction.
Oh, absolutely. It is everywhere.
Right. It is just this narrative that is so deeply baked into our collective consciousness that we don't even question it anymore. I mean, we just accept it.
Yeah, the story basically goes that the solid, dependable middle of society is just hollowing out.
Exactly. Leaving behind this tiny few ultra-rich people at the top and a massive struggling population at the bottom.
Right.
But what if I told you that the middle class isn't actually shrinking because people are falling into poverty? What if it's shrinking because a massive chunk of them just got rich?
I mean, that is the ultimate counter-narrative right there.
Yeah.
It completely disrupts this classic American economic ghost story that we've been telling ourselves for the last couple of decades, really.
It really does.
We are just so conditioned to view any reduction in the size of the middle class as a sign of societal decline. But the actual data underneath those headlines, it paints a much more complex and, frankly, a much more optimistic picture.
And that is exactly what we have a big stack of sources in front of us to explore today on this deep dive.
Yeah, some really fascinating stuff.
We are looking at a recent article by Nee Andrews, which pulls from April 2026 data in the Wall Street Journal. And that is built on this long-term research from the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI.
Right, the AEI data is key here.
Right. So the mission for our deep dive today, for you listening, is to investigate this massive, completely surprising economic insight that completely flips the doom and gloom narrative. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's steer.
Because if the middle class didn't collapse into the lower class, where exactly did it go? And the sources we are analyzing make this incredibly bold claim. They say the middle class didn't disappear. It climbed.
It climbed. And the statistics behind this upward migration are just staggering when you track them over a long enough timeline.
I mean, how long of a timeline are we talking about here?
So the AEI research analyzed income data stretching from 1979 all the way up to 2024.
Oh, wow. So like 45 years of data.
Exactly. And crucially, they didn't just look at who was sitting in the statistical middle compared to everyone else at any given year.
Right.
They looked at absolute inflation-adjusted purchasing power. So they established a specific standard of living, defining the upper middle class as a family of three earning roughly $133,000 to $400,000 in today's dollars.
Okay. So we are talking about a very comfortable, highly secure tier of living.
Very comfortable. I mean, you are doing well in that bracket. Now, back in 1979, guess how many people were in that tier? Only about 10% of Americans earned enough to fall into that upper middle class bracket.
Just 10%.
Just 10. But by 2024, that number had tripled.
Wait, tripled.
Yeah, 31% of Americans are now residing in that upper middle class tier.
A tripling of the upper middle class over 45 years? That is wild. But what about the other end of the spectrum?
Right, the lower end.
Yeah, because the usual assumption, when we talk about inequality, is that the top grows and the bottom grows while the middle just vanishes.
Right, the hollowing out theory. But the data contradicts that assumption, too.
Really?
Yeah, the population considered poor or near poor didn't expand at all. It actually fell from 30% in 1979 down to 19% in 2024.
Okay, I can almost hear you listening to this, maybe on your commute or at the gym right now, thinking the exact same thing I'm thinking.
Which is?
How can a group shrink while the underlying reality is actually getting better? Like, if fewer people are poor and way more people are upper middle class, why is the quote-unquote shrinking middle class reported as this massive tragedy?
Right. Well, what's fascinating here is the critical difference between absolute income and relative income.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. This distinction is really the engine behind the grand illusion of the shrinking middle class. When economists or media outlets use a relative definition, they define the middle class mathematically.
Meaning they just look at the median.
Exactly. Usually it's defined as anyone earning between 66% and 200% of the median income for that specific year.
Okay, so it reminds me of, like, track and field.
Oh, I like that, yeah.
Right. If you are judging an athlete's performance relatively, it is like watching a high jump competition where every time a massive group of athletes successfully clears the bar, the officials just raise the bar higher.
Yes.
And then the commentators look at the field and complain that fewer people are clearing the middle height today.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. That's exactly what's happening. If the entire country is getting richer in real terms, like
Yeah.
if that median income keeps moving up because the overall economy is expanding, the boundaries of what we call the middle move up right alongside it.
So the goalposts are literally moving.
Exactly. So as massive chunks of the population get wealthier and move upward, they statistically age out of the middle bracket. The middle shrinks as a percentage of the total population, yes.
But only because people are graduating into the upper middle class.
Yes. So it's a graduation rate, not a dropout rate. When you switch to measuring absolute income locking in the specific standard of living, adjusting it rigorously for inflation over the decades, and seeing how many people can afford that standard, you see phenomenal gains.
Wow.
Yeah. In real inflation-adjusted terms, a much larger slice of America is living at income levels that we used to consider strictly affluent.
Okay, I hear the data,
Mm.
and I understand the difference between relative and absolute metrics. It makes sense. But let's look at the underlying mechanics here.
Here, the how and why.
Because a massive society-wide upward shift doesn't just happen in a vacuum. People
Yeah.
didn't just wake up over the last 4 decades and find extra zeros in their bank accounts, right?
Right, it wasn't magic.
So what were the actual structural engines pulling these families upward into that $133,000 to $400,000 bracket?
Well, it was a combination of several structural forces acting together. The first was the fundamental shift into the knowledge economy.
Okay.
Across the decades, despite, dot-com busts and financial crises and all that, the economic premium for specialized skills just skyrocketed. Real income broadly rose faster than general inflation, but it heavily, heavily favored cognitive labor over manual labor.
Which leads right into the massive payoff of education, which the sources highlight.
Yes, the education premium.
The article points out that today, 55% of all bachelor's degree holders sit in the upper middle class or higher.
Yeah, more than half.
And for those with advanced degrees, it's 68%. But why did that specific premium explode so violently compared to, say, the 1970s?
Basically, globalization and technology. In 1979, the American economy still had this massive manufacturing base.
Right, where a high school diploma could secure a pretty solid middle-class life.
Exactly. But as manufacturing moved offshore and automation increased over the years, the domestic economy became hyper-focused on technology, finance, healthcare administration, specialized services, that sort of thing.
So the bachelor's degree became the new baseline.
Yeah, it went from being a mark of prestige to the absolute baseline filter for entering the corporate workforce. The economic returns on higher education compounded dramatically because the entire global economy was suddenly bidding for that specific cognitive talent.
That makes total sense for the individual worker. But the statistic that really jumped off the page for me, and I think this is the real secret to this whole phenomenon, is about the household.
Yes, the dual earners.
Over 80% of upper middle and higher income households are dual earners.
Yeah.
80%.
I mean, it is the defining characteristic of modern affluence. The entrance of women into the workforce in massive numbers didn't just add, incremental spending money.
Right.
It fundamentally rewired household earning power.
It's like a two-stage rocket. Education gets you off the ground, but adding a second earner pushes the whole household into orbit.
That's a great way to put it.
But I do want to introduce some friction here, because I think a lot of people listening might take issue with framing this purely as a triumphant story of upward mobility.
I completely agree. There's a flip side to this.
Like comparing a 1979 household, where one parent could often afford to work 40 hours a week while the other raised the kids, to a 2024 household where both parents are grinding 50 hours a week just to afford a house in a decent school district.
Right.
Is that actually upward mobility? Or is that just a societal treadmill where families are forced to run twice as fast just to maintain the exact same feeling of security?
That is an incredibly sharp critique, and it really cuts to the heart of sociological shifts versus purely economic ones.
Yeah, because it feels different.
You are touching on what economists call the two-income trap. The absolute data tells us that the modern dual-income household has vastly more purchasing power, better technology, larger homes, and higher overall consumption than the single-earner household of 1979.
On paper, they are richer.
Right, on paper. But you are absolutely right that this economic leverage came with a massive loss of household autonomy and free time. The necessity of dual incomes to compete in today's housing and education markets means families are economically richer, but they are often completely time bankrupt.
And it compounds over generations, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Like the boomers rode the initial wave of this dual-income, highly educated structure to accumulate massive wealth over decades. But how does this data account for millennials?
That's the big question everyone asks.
Because the prevailing narrative, the one we hear all the time, is that millennials are the first generation destined to be poorer than their parents.
Right. And the millennial narrative is fascinating right now because it is currently undergoing a massive revision.
Really? A revision.
Yeah. Millennials had a notoriously terrible start. I mean, many graduated straight into the teeth of the 2008 financial crisis.
Which depressed their starting wages and basically delayed their wealth accumulation by, what, a decade?
Exactly. But the recent data shows an incredible acceleration. In the 2010s and early 2020s, as they finally entered their peak earning years and fully utilized that dual income, highly educated household structure, their wage growth just skyrocketed.
So they caught up.
They did more than catch up. Add in the beginnings of a great wealth transfer from their boomer parents, and millennials are actually catching up incredibly fast. On an inflation-adjusted basis, many are now on track to surpass their parents' standard of living at the exact same age.
Wow. So we have built this incredible wealth-generating machine. We have dual incomes, a massive education premium, real wage growth for skilled labor, and a generation finally hitting its stride.
Right.
But if you're listening to this on a commute from the suburbs right now, mentally calculating your daycare costs against your mortgage rate, you know exactly what I'm about to say.
Yeah.
People aren't popping champagne. They are panicked.
Absolutely.
If people are doing so much better on paper, why does it feel so much worse in reality? Are rising costs completely canceling out these income gains? Is this just hyper-concentrated in a few lucky pockets?
Those anxieties are entirely validated by the underlying mechanics of inflation. The disconnect between the optimistic data and the pessimistic public mood really comes down to where the inflation is happening in the modern economy.
Break that down for us, because I think this is crucial.
Okay, so when we measure general inflation, we are looking at a broad basket of goods: TVs, cars, food, clothing, software, all of that.
The typical consumer stuff.
Right. And historically, because of global supply chains and technological efficiency, many of those consumer goods have gotten cheaper and vastly better.
True.
But the big three non-negotiable pillars of a middle-class life are housing, education, and healthcare.
The big three.
Yeah. And the costs for those specific unavoidable things have risen vastly faster than general inflation.
Which perfectly explains the tension. Like, your 65-inch flat-screen TV is cheaper than it was 10 years ago, but the house you want to put it in feels entirely out of reach.
Precisely. And this is driven by phenomena like Baumol's cost disease in healthcare and education.
Wait, what's Baumol's cost disease?
It's where prices rise in sectors with stagnant productivity growth simply because wages are rising across the broader economy. It costs more to hire a doctor or a professor today, even if they aren't treating more patients or teaching more students than they did in 1980.
Oh, I see.
And in housing, you have massive supply constraints driven by zoning laws and NIMBYism. This is why a household earning $150,000 or even $250,000 today often does not feel wealthy at all.
Even though statistically they're in the upper middle class.
Right. Their absolute income is high, but the absolute cost of the specific markers of a quote-unquote good life, a home in a safe neighborhood with good schools, college tuition without crippling debt, medical security, that stuff eats up that high income incredibly fast.
And geography acts as a massive multiplier on that stress, too. The sources highlight this brilliantly.
Geography is huge.
Earning $200,000 in San Francisco, Seattle, or New York City, you might genuinely feel like you are barely treading water.
Oh, yeah.
You are probably renting a small apartment, your childcare costs are equivalent to a second mortgage, and you just feel entirely squeezed. But take that exact same $200,000 income and drop it into a mid-sized city in the Midwest or the Sun Belt.
The reality shifts completely.
Night and day.
Yeah, in those markets, that exact same income provides a large home, 2 cars, family vacations, and aggressive retirement savings. It is the exact same absolute income on the spreadsheet, but an entirely different psychological and practical reality.
This raises the whole concept of feeling rich on paper, but broke in reality, which brings us to the psychological side of this equation.
Yes. This raises an important question about human psychology and how we process economic data. At our core, we do not evaluate our success by consulting a spreadsheet of inflation-adjusted metrics from 1979.
Nobody does that.
No. We evaluate our success by looking over the fence at our neighbors.
The comparison trap.
Exactly. We measure our progress relative to our peers. And the problem today is that we live in a hypervisible, digitally connected age. The quote-unquote others we are comparing ourselves to are no longer just the families on our cul-de-sac.
Right, it's global now.
The cultural conversation is entirely dominated by inequality debates, specifically focusing on the wealth of the top 1%, or even the top 0.1%.
Yeah, you open your phone and immediately see billionaires launching rockets or influencers giving house tours of $20 million mansions in Calabasas. It completely warps your baseline for what success actually looks like.
So even though your own absolute living standard has risen, even though your dual income household gives you more purchasing power, better healthcare technology, and a higher absolute income than someone in your exact position 40 years ago, you feel like you are falling behind.
Because the gap between you and the very top is so in your face.
Yes. Because the extreme top of the income distribution has pulled away so visibly and so rapidly, everyone feels poor when their daily feed is benchmarking them against the ultra-wealthy.
It's the high jump analogy playing out in our own heads. We keep raising the bar for what we think making it actually means, and then we punish ourselves for not clearing it.
Exactly. Our expectations for the baseline of a good life have inflated just as fast, if not faster, than our actual incomes. We expect higher quality, more safety, more space, and more convenience than previous generations ever did.
So what does this all mean? We are sitting here with two basically conflicting truths.
Right.
On one hand, the data is undeniable. We are richer and more upwardly mobile than we were half a century ago.
That is a fact.
On the other hand, the anxiety is also real. We are stressed, we are time bankrupt, squeezed by housing and healthcare, and constantly feeling like we're losing a race against the top 1%. How should you, the listener, process this paradox?
Well, you process it by stepping back and looking at the 50-year scorecard without all the noise of social media. When you examine the long-term trend, it is a story of broad-based progress. Over the last half-century, lower-income households are 55% richer in real terms.
55%.
Middle-income households are 60% richer, and upper-income households are 78% richer.
So the rising tide really did lift the boats across the board.
It did. That is not stagnation. We really have to decouple the idea of a shrinking middle class from the idea of economic decline. The math shows the middle class shrinking as a percentage, yes, but the reality is that the middle class is graduating.
It's graduated.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes how we view the future.
It really does.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we realize why holding on to the correct narrative is so vital. The stories we tell ourselves shape our political and social reality. If we convince ourselves that the system is entirely broken, that it is a zero-sum game, and that everything is collapsing into a dystopian nightmare, we just become fatalistic.
Right, we just spend all our energy looking for someone to blame for the decline.
We just argue over whose fault the collapse is, rather than looking at what actually worked. But if we accurately understand the data, if we recognize the actual mechanics of how progress happened over the last 45 years, we can study it.
We can replicate it.
Exactly. We can look at the power of the knowledge economy, the impact of women maximizing their earning potential, and the real wage growth of skilled labor. We can figure out how to unblock the supply chains in housing and healthcare to make those gains actually go further.
Make life feel easier.
Right. And crucially, we can figure out how to make those engines more inclusive for the 19% of the population that is still near the poverty line.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The ultimate takeaway from these sources, the twist ending to this whole economic ghost story, is that the middle class didn't disappear. It evolved.
It really did.
It moved upward into completely new income brackets, it adopted entirely new lifestyles, and it developed vastly different expectations for what a normal, successful life should look like.
And that is the true, largely untold success story of the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Yeah.
But it does bring us to the immediate challenge of our current moment. The challenge is no longer about proving that upward mobility happened in the past. I mean, the data settles that debate.
The numbers are the numbers.
The real challenge for policymakers, for economists, and for everyone listening is making sure that the latter remains fundamentally accessible for the next generation. We have to ensure that the systemic bottlenecks, specifically the skyrocketing costs of housing and education, don't eventually saw off the bottom rungs of that ladder.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the mechanics we discussed today. That incredible upward mobility of the last 40 years was heavily fueled by the transition from a single-earner economy to a dual-earner economy.
Right, the second earner.
That second income, acting as a booster rocket for household wealth, was a massive structural advantage. But mathematically, that is a trick society can only pull off once.
Yeah, you can't keep adding people.
Exactly. You can't transition from a two-earner household to a three-earner household just to keep ahead of rising costs. So, now that our households are largely maxed out on the number of working adults, what will the next engine of upward mobility have to be for the upcoming generation? If the economy is going to keep raising that high jump bar, how are we going to make sure the next generation has the leverage to clear it?
That is the defining economic puzzle we will have to solve in the decades ahead.
A brilliant question to leave off on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.